Good evening. Thank you all very much for being here tonight. I'm so happy that you're all here, and I am so glad that we're all going to hear from Anita and, of course, Michel. I think it's a special occasion because, in a way, with Anita Berrizbeitia being the new chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture, this is a special opportunity for us to, in a sense, hear some of her thoughts, her agendas, and plans, what she's thinking. I've known Anita for a long time, and I think during this period of friendship, I've really come to admire her as an individual, as a practitioner of landscape architecture, as a writer, and as an amazing teacher. And I think the combination of all those things is not so common. Sometimes you might have one of those things, sometimes you have two of them, but it's rare to get the three things together. And I think Anita, since she graduated from the GSD in the late 80s, has really spent quite a reasonable amount of time in practice, and then, of course, also with writing and her own research. And I think her work on Roberto Burle Marx, the book that she did together with Linda Pollock, Inside Outside, many of her other writings and publications, I think, have straddled beautifully between landscape history and contemporary practice, and really dealing also with questions of urbanization. It's linked to landscape architecture. But I think she brings a very specific and, in a way, detailed focus and attention to landscape architecture. Yesterday I was talking to somebody about an artist called Teresita Fernandez, who was here last year. And during our conversation, she started mentioning the fact that, there are a lot of people who talk, but there are very few people who listen. And in some ways, I think that's very true about Anita, that she does listen. Sometimes I want her to talk more, but to hear her. But I think it's amazing to know that this is someone who's really an incredibly reflective person. And I think when she speaks, it's something that she's really thought about. And I think that really matters. So I'm very excited that she's going to talk to us about some of her ideas specifically related to the theme of process. After Anita speaks, not a full lecture, but a brief lecture, then she will also engage Michel Desvigne, and together they will have a conversation. Michel, as you know, is the Hornbeck visiting critic here at the GSD. He's been coming here for the last few years, and I've also known Michel for a very long time, and he's an amazing landscape architect who really has done so much to move landscape architecture as a profession, as a discipline in France, but also, of course, in many other places. One thing that I would say about Michel is that he is one of the very few landscape practitioners that I know who's really made a systematic, significant contribution to issues of representation in landscape architecture. I mean, he and I haven't talked about this, but I know that representation really matters for Michel. So this is also exciting when we're really addressing the question of process between Anita and Michel Desvigne. So would you please join me in welcoming Anita Berrizbeitia.
Well, thank you, Mohsen, for such a wonderful introduction. Where are you? There you are. And again, thank you for the opportunity of having me serve the department and the school. It has been a really wonderful year collaborating with you, and I look forward to more. I also want to, even though Charles couldn't be here, tonight he's out at the Gardner with Mario Shetland. I also want to say thank you to him for everything he did in the past 6 years, for his energy, for how he reinvigorated so many aspects of landscape architecture education. And that will be a tough pace to follow. And all the best to Charles and the Office for Urbanization, and I look forward to more collaborations. And then lastly, Pablo Perez Ramos, thank you for all your help with the putting together this presentation, and for all the exchanges over the past few years. Okay. So, process-based design and its related terms, such as open-ended, the indeterminate, the aleatory, the dynamic, and so on, are ideas that have been at the forefront of landscape architecture for more than 2 decades, in fact, almost 3. And tonight I'd like to suggest that as a concept, the idea of process needs to be re-examined. And I will do so through a discussion of the notion of precision, an idea that is usually associated with architecture, of course with computation, with certain practices of art, music, poetry, but rarely with landscape, although landscape for sure embodies notions of precision. I have followed Michel Desvigne's work for the last 3 decades. Ever since I first saw in the late 1980s this image, I had just graduated from the GSD. I didn't understand it, but I decided I would spend the rest of the next few decades thinking about it. And this is the experimental gardens that he did while he was at the French Academy in Rome. Michel's work is often described as indeterminate, deferred, and open-ended, yet it is impossible to overlook the fact that it is at the same time highly precise and full of definition. So as Mohsen mentioned, the program for tonight is that I will talk, and I will talk for about 36 minutes. And then we will hear, trying to be precise, we will hear from Michel in conversation with me and you, how this idea plays out in his practice and in the way landscape architecture is conceived in Europe as opposed to the United States. So usually positioned as inherent to the medium, process-based design works with and foregrounds the landscape's continual state of transformation. As seasons pass, as vegetation grows and dies, as it responds to shifting hydrological cycles, or the larger and abstract yet deeply defining economies of the urbanized world. By now, we have a fleshed out genealogy with its accompanying lexicon of concepts that, at least in the US, moves between phenomenology and the ecology of neoliberalism, or from an internalized perception of time as an aesthetic experience to technique, or to landscape as enabler of global urbanization. Very schematically, a timeline of this evolution of process in design would look something like this. In the late 1980s and 1990s, during its phenomenological stage, it was called process-based design, or open-ended design, exemplified by the early work of George Hargreaves and Michael van Valkenburg. By a decade later, in 2001, Julia Cerniak's formulation of framework versus appearance was a key text that marked a sort of great divide in our field, creating a dichotomy that is very much present today. In parallel, ecology itself was also evolving from an equilibrium model to an ecosystem model of constant change. More recently, there's a significant focus on performance, flux and flows, sustainability and ecological services, and the notion that design is setting up the conditions for future and unknown events to occur is still widely practiced. At the same time, however, other concepts emerged that sought to articulate scales to the idea of a purely open-ended process. George Hargreaves and Julia Cerniak, in their edited volume Large Parks of 2007, and in his work during his time as chairman of the department here, introduced the concepts of scales of landscape management as a way to shape a more nuanced articulation of temporality in the landscape medium, especially as it related to public space. My own essay titled Scales of Undecidability of 2011, and apologies again for that title, argued for a midway position between the fully open and the static in the conceptualization of landscapes. Beth Meyer's The Performance of Appearance of 2008 links two concepts that were not yet understood to belong together. And more recently, ideas that have to do with subtle forms of intervention, such as the curation of ecologies and managed succession, continue to be explored by our students and in practices as a further exploration of the relationship between process and design. So, although process and its related concepts have been extremely fruitful to expand the field and its modes of practice, it also has a less promising side. Often, especially today, it becomes a conceptual glass wall, an impediment to propositional design, to experimental risk-taking, to the point that we're about to reach a kind of one-size-fits-all kind of problem. Yet we know that from the vernacular to the infrastructural, design unceasingly proves that highest conditions of flexibility, what we call today adaptability or resilience, are always reached through great precision and specificity. In order for something to be adaptable, it has to be precisely designed to be adaptable and not just be not designed. But more importantly, the idea of process is limiting today because it works against the agency of design as a political and social project, which entails imagination and critical thinking. I would like to propose that the future of design lies not in focusing on the things that will happen anyway, but in giving shape to things that would not otherwise happen, and yet need urgently to happen. So I will shift the conversation to the idea of precision as a necessary dimension of landscape architecture that needs to be pursued, tracked, theorized, in order to imagine alternative futures. I see this as a key agenda for the coming years in our department. I am privileged to be working with such an extraordinary group of faculty. I am inspired by the work that you all do. I am energized by it, and I invite you to join me in contributing your diverse approaches to this project. I will begin with the notion of the interface. By interface, I mean that which makes possible the connection between two different things, as, for example, the link between nature as found and the society that interacts with it in precise ways. For instance, the laws and institutions that describe and protect the public realm are examples of the interface that connect landscapes of scenic and historic value with people In 1872, when Yosemite National Park was created, the United States had a land tenure system with only one type, private property. This was also the situation in Boston before the creation of the Metropolitan Park System in 1893. In both cases, in order to set aside land and protect it from development so that it could be enjoyed by all for future generations, a new category of land had to be created through advocacy, public debate, the crafting of laws, voting, etc., that would establish the institutional support for their establishment. In other words, an interface between land and society had to be created that enabled that category of public space to exist and for others like it to follow. The same could be said about the High Line in New York City, made possible by a complicated process of transfer of development rights, a mechanism often used in New York to preserve buildings and landscapes of historical significance. The fundraising for private monies through well-established practices was also extensive. The very successful park that was installed there would not have been possible without these legal and financial operations. And it would not be possible for it to persist in the future without them continuing to be there. So laws that establish different forms of land tenure, that enable private monies to participate in the maintenance of the public realm, and that regulate use are designed interfaces that connect people to landscapes. Landscapes, then, are epiphenomena of larger economic and political forces, as the cases just mentioned demonstrate. This table shows how new categories of landscape emerge when major shifts in the modes of production and reception occur, or, in other words, when a new interface between landscape and society appears. This table is still a work in progress. I hope you can read it. We can talk about it later, but please note the shifting location of this thick black line, which maps out the emergence of new categories and with it of a new interface of landscape. Note also the significant expansion of the categories of landscape when we hit industrialization in the 19th century and their continuing development in the post-industrial and the global economy. This list will continue to grow, I am sure, as we address the challenges of inequity and climate change. Landscape itself is an interface, of course. It is the result of reworking the materials of nature for social occupation, an idea that is core to J.B. Jackson's definition of landscape. Moving away from a pictorial understanding, he defines landscape as a composition of man-made or man-modified spaces to serve as an infrastructure or background for our collective existence. And a landscape is not a natural feature of the environment, but a synthetic space, a man-made system of spaces superimposed on the face of the land, functioning and evolving, not according to natural laws, but in order to serve a community. In other words, landscape, in Jackson's formulation, is the interface between nature as found and community as the shaper of that found condition. The interface between economy, ecology, territory, and those who live in it is severed with colonial practices of resource extraction. Monofunctional infrastructures that maximize economic profit, efficiencies of extraction, distribution, ignore territorial intelligence, local economies, and destroy environmental coherence. Using as case study a proposal for the development of an extensive hydroelectric project in the Chilean Patagonia, we asked in a research seminar and studio, how is it possible to connect the vastly different scales of a global demand for copper With a failed national policy of agrarian reform that resulted in environmental degradation at a massive scale, and a struggling economy of sheep herding. We propose that landscape is the connective medium, the great mediator between abstract economic forces that play out elsewhere and local conditions that receive the impact of those forces. And we did so by exploring how the infrastructure of dams, reservoirs, power line corridors, and temporary worker housing could be reconceptualized as interface to regenerate this devastated landscape. The interfaces were studied not only in terms of expanding the infrastructure landscape overlap, but we insisted on the notion of hybrid landscapes of human consequence, those that would transform and anchor this foreign economy through the landscape in productive ways. Our method was to implement several operations in order to open up the spaces of the interface and deconstruct the singularity of the technical program of the infrastructure. Concepts related to colonization, such as implantation, hybridization, mutation, substitution, symbiosis, parasitism, and cross-programming were used as generative concepts to expand the notion of the interface. We explored 4 types: a productive interface, whereby expansion of the basic program of the infrastructure would create synergies between gravel mining, landfill, and other topographic operations and programs, and between temporary worker housing and expansion of villages. The ecological interface used techniques to manage new sedimentation patterns generated by changes in hydrology, which served as a starting point for the creation of new landscapes. The tourism interface, where we looked for opportunities to expand a stunted tourism industry, and the interface between productive and recreational programs. And lastly, a social interface, where we explore the restructuring of the design of the infrastructure so that it would have minimum negative impact and maximum positive effects on the inhabitants of the area. Precision, as a quality that joins intentionality to effect, is a generative concept because it demands that landscape be put to previously unforeseen uses that counters, debilitates, destroys the binary global-local, urban-non-urban, colonized and colonial, or colonial-colonized rather. In other words, the many operations associated with the development of an energy corridor are opportunities for integration and hybridization through this notion of the precise interface. Undoing the profit-maximizing, deterritorializing monofunctionality of these infrastructures entails establishing precise forms of exchange between research and design, such that design procedures can be invented to redirect global flows of neoliberalism towards the region and transform them into agents of territorial integration. In this sense, the interface is what mediates between global economies and local ecologies. Now, in the real world outside academia, most of the work that landscape architects do exists within an already well-established institutional framework. In this case, the interface is not about generating new categories of hybrid landscapes and their supporting institutions, but a question of representation, of form, of technology, of materials, and scale. For example, these 2 technologies, the perspectival frame and the parkway, are devices that connect people to landscape. One through enabling observation and measure, and the other enables access to new places. Both are, therefore, types of interfaces. Here, I will argue for precision as enabler of new public realms social spaces that reflect sociocultural concerns and evolving social practices. I will talk very briefly about 3 projects, one in Caracas, one in Santiago, Chile, and one in France, the Museum Park at Louvre-Lens. These are public parks designed in places that are not only underserved socially and economically, but with little prospects of growth and change in the short term. These are not public spaces in the service of an erupting and robust capitalism, but grounds for new social and participatory practices in the context of high-risk communities. And more specifically, I would talk about a topography, a surface, and an atmosphere. One of the challenges with process, one of its limitations, is that it is difficult to calibrate. With a fully open come both the good and the bad. How do we design for a more precise notion of openness? How to understand distinctions, not as rigid categories, as, for example, in the nature-culture binary of modernity, or the complete blurring of actuality of postmodernity, but as a space of precise negotiation. In this competition proposal for a public park in the Air Force Base in Caracas, our overriding concept was both literal, access to the site, and metaphorical, access to the political processes of a decaying democracy. The military Air Force Base is a huge void in the city, a gigantic urban wall. We countered the condition of the wall with, paradoxically, a colossal wall, a monumental earthwork, but one that works to keep some things out. Let's see. Okay. I don't know how to go back, but there's a 8-lane highway here that we wanted to keep out, and this is the colossal earthwork. Okay, so, and enable others to come in, such as direct pedestrian connection and participation from all the surrounding communities through a sectional condition. In addition, the reversal of the natural drainage pattern to avoid more flooding from the river gave the earthwork a site logic, provided spectator seating around the sports fields enclosed by this monumental topography, created an elevated promenade that would allow the extremely unusual experience of the valley along its longitudinal dimension, bringing the city as landscape into the park. The 2009-2011 renovation of the Quinta Normal de Agricultura, a 19th century garden for acclimatization of European species of the temperate zone into the semi-arid environment of Santiago, Chile, entailed the contradictory purposes of preserving the horticultural collection, a mature collection of majestic trees, and the transformation of the grounds into a public park for a densely populated and underserved part of Santiago, Chile. The greatest and most precise design intervention are a series of thin surfaces in stone, wood, and stone dust, all of which do not amount to more than 30 centimeters or 12 inches in thickness, enabling the social occupation of the space while preserving the pre-existing trees. Here we see not only the power of a surface or a topography precisely described, but that of form as communicative of that interface. The architectural treatment of the ground, its formal expressive character, its precise definition as a series of thinly laminated surfaces that negotiate between the trees, gives expression and boundedness without restraint to this public park. The ground appears and performs as precise surface of contact, the very definition of an interface, between old forest canopy and new public realm. In these two cases, precise form needs not to be dismissed as static or formalistic, but as enabler. Another highly precise ground is that of the Museum Park Louvre-Lens, a collaborative project by Catherine Mosbach and Kazuyo Sejima of Sana and others on a 62-acre former coal mining site in the north of France. As has been often stated, the design registers the historical traces of the mining economy, preserves the vegetation of exotic species that emerge in its disturbed and toxic soil, and sets up a series of curated successional ecologies in the gardens. But I think it is reductive to describe their intentions only in terms of its mining past and its biotic properties. What is evident here is a series of intentional distortions and interpretations and reinterpretations that bring together all the forces that have been at work here, past, latent, or active, to coalesce through a negotiation that critically calibrates their presence on the park. Mosbach, in her recent presentation here last winter, used the words condensation, contamination of forms and uses, initiation, and consolidation to describe the conceptual frameworks for her project. She also used the word transfiguration, more importantly, because it describes what it achieves, a transformation to a different state. Architecture and landscape collaborate to draw in an entire milieu, an ambience, a delicate presence that diverts attention away from the politics of dominant urban institutions and towards that particular place and moment in time. The slight curvature of the brushed aluminum facade and the wet pavement from the almost constant rain that falls there produced soft blurred reflections that bring in the larger landscape, the horizon, and the sky. The extremely precise, then, can give way to indeterminacy if it is designed to do so. Donald Judd's boxes are precise to an extreme. Further, minute yet highly precise variations on the planes that form the boxes expand an interface of perception. Similarly, Joseph Albers gets to the indeterminate through the highly precise manipulation of lines. And Alberto Burri, in his process paintings, works analogously to landscape by setting the conditions for a process to unfold and then stopping that process when the desired state is achieved. But the process begins with a highly precise mixture of acrylic paint and glue that cracks differentially over the cellotex surface. The precise enables, paradoxically, the complex and even the contradictory. Our park in Caracas, proposal, competition, Quinta Normal, Louvre-Lens, are just a few examples of many that could be listed, but they seem to be clear cases of projects where a notion of precision precedes any predetermined notion of process, even of ecology, although they certainly do not preclude them, arriving at a new kind of synthesis, a precise synthesis. I should mention that both the Quinta Normal and the Museum Park projects are pieces of a larger landscape that are described and argued for in terms of a larger urbanistic logic. And this, of course, still remains extremely necessary. And it is one, because it is one that it is bound to accessibility. It is also the logic of the abstract diagram, of distributions and concentrations, of program circulation and other flows. And the two parks work very well as connective pieces in these larger networks. But their identity is not attached to those diagrams. The figured grounds emerge as a series of locally embedded decisions that stay local, in spite of simultaneously assisting the flow of abstract forces that weave through their territories. Lastly, Michel Desvigne's proposition of landscape as an intermediate nature is another expression of the notion of the precise interface. As I mentioned before, although his work is often described as indeterminate, deferred, open-ended, it is impossible to overlook the fact that it is at the same time highly precise and full of definition, achieving what he calls coherent physical results. This is not work that projects naturalism. Its technical precision is its most salient characteristic. After 3 decades of practice, his work has engaged the full spectrum of material, formal, technical, and professional frameworks of implementation. His collaborative projects with architects are examples of works that operate within an already framed interface, such as museums, plazas, and courtyards. However, at the same time, from the beginning of his career, Michel Desvigne has had unusual commissions for landscapes that did not exist yet as sites of intervention at the signing of the contracts, such as Bordeaux, Saclay, and Eurolens. They have required new forms of client-designer agreements, new forms of working, because these are projects that take many years, if not decades, to be implemented. So while this would classify the work as projective, it is a kind of highly precise projective, driven by pragmatic, empirical, highly technical considerations, as opposed to the more abstract vector-based projective. As Gilles Teberjan says, Michel's drawings are descriptive, analytical, and at the same time, they play a constructive role, since, quote, in revealing this role, it creates the very thing it unveils. Michel has written, quote, we are not content, with terrain vagues, lacking any defined function. The fabric that gradually emerges, consisting of parks and public spaces that are shared, private, or semi-collective, is an urban fabric. By forging relationships between the public space and the built components, it is possible to consider other ways of making the city, end of quote. And later, he states, the point is to rapidly create in the city beautiful, joyous settings that can be appropriated. By using certain techniques borrowed from the world of agriculture, it is possible to attain coherent physical results. The early phases of some rural landscapes are perfectly acceptable aesthetically and architecturally. So to say simply that this work is only process is to disregard so much more than is present in the work. Rather than an indeterminate naturalism, this work is a precise space of negotiation between past traces, geographical structures, agricultural practices, and the vision for a future realm. And I quote Michel again, we are interested in the res publica. We contribute to the formation of a common territory. We transform landscapes produced by society. To see, to make legible. This is a necessary precondition, but one that cannot take the place of a kind of interior necessity. The showcasing of traces is not enough. To content oneself with that would be like doing restoration work. But to commandeer those traces, to invert or distort them, therein lies the innovation. End of quote. So, what is at stake here? That the art of landscape would fall into an unquestioned expectation for naturalism that covers over rather than reveal. I am suggesting a kind of reversal in a way of working, which would focus on the difficulty of making, not on the things that would happen on their own. The precisely designed interface negotiates. Its forms reveal rather than obscure. Its high definition communicates, draws in, describes, and enables. And with that, thank you for listening, for your attention. Michel, thank you for being here. And I invite you to sit here. Okay, still thinking? Okay, and so let's see, how are we going to run this? I have a few questions for you. You can offer a kind of response to begin with. Yes, I have many questions for you. Let's see, is this on? Yes, any questions? So I want you to tell us a little bit, and we talked about a week ago or 2 weeks ago about this event, about my interests, about the kinds of questions that I'm raising. And you had mentioned the necessity in Europe now, and at the beginning of your career, of reinventing, of making work, of making new kinds of work that a young practice could tackle. Could you comment on how that led to these very large scale in time, the projects of Bordeaux, Saclay, Eurolans, one. How does precision then enter into this necessity to approach work in a different way? And can you talk about these kinds of framework agreements that you had to establish as opposed to regular contractual work with the municipalities and the cities?
So first I must say thank you, Anita, to address this issue of process. And the way I mean, your lecture is really, according to me, a key moment in this school, because I must confess that sometimes there could have been some simplistic caricature opposing processes and design. And it's sometimes easy to be so simplistic. And I probably must confess some weakness in some discussion we have had with students. And so that's very important to address this kind of thing. And the way you do not oppose but associate the two words, process and precision, is a great way not to be in this caricature of process versus design, which is stupid. Because there is always a strong tentation to be anti-intellectual. Sorry about this in France, but you can understand. So thank you. So then, in a very in a very pragmatic way, I must say, because it's a kind of paradox for myself too. When I used to teach here 17 years ago, and Pierre Bélanger used to be my student, then my assistant. He's not here.
He escaped.
So we started with kind of processes, and maybe he went a little bit too far, but and back from 3 years here, maybe I'm a little bit too far in the opposite way, within a science, in very pragmatic project. Okay, so then, why processes in Europe? And your question was precise. I mean, being here, I discovered a little bit late park systems and was very impressed about what has been done in the US at the 19th century, which is exactly what we need to do to improve, to transform our territories in Europe, as in the US today as well. So definitely when you think about the power of this coherence given by this park system, it's exactly the strong tool that could help us give quality to our 20th century cities. And by the way, in this course with Pierre Bélanger, it's exactly what we did. We started in Boston to reinvent park system in a way to refurbish the missing framework of the contemporary city. Is that English? Maybe more or less. So if you just, we took in account, abandoned railway tracks, and this was enough to rebuild a kind of park system that could help build a framework today. So not what, as it was done in the 19th century, but in a transformation process, not the building of a city. So that's it. So of course in Europe, it's something we have to do. At the 20th century, we have been building a lot of houses and buildings, not necessarily cities. And we probably forgot to build our public spaces. And today we have to build this big missing framework. So I'm lucky doing this trip quite every 2 weeks between the US and France, and green grass is greener in the US, of course. So I could convince people in Europe that we should do something in our cities. But of course, there is no commission for this. First, usually, so it's all about public commission. That's key. That's a key point in the conversation. I mean, it's not about private commission. It's about a public commission that doesn't exist. Why it doesn't exist? Because first, usually this kind of land are not necessarily owned by the community. Then there is no budget. Probably there is no program. So as landscape architect, we could have the intuition, like in Bordeaux, that along the river, there should be stupidly a park. But the city has first to buy the land, to define a program, and to find a budget, and then to find somebody to do it. But because, so sorry to be so precise, but this is your theme.
That's the point.
That's a very important point. I mean, it is about public commission, but public commissions have regulation. And usually, to be the landscape architect or the architect needs a competition process, and a competition process is related to a site, a budget, a program. And we have none of these three components. So that's why we first physically can only deal with process, because we have to organize the acquisition, is that English, of land. We have to organize a programmatic vision, and we have to organize on a long term the construction of the sites. So it can, of course, I would love to draw in a few minutes a large park. It's easy, in reality. But you cannot do it. So because of these three components, no site, no program, no budget. So we have to organize it in a long term, and it is necessarily a process. Then to be back in precision to the commission, we didn't fit in the regulation of public commissions. So we had to invent something, and it happened. It took us some decades, but the precise word is, I have to translate it, accord-cadre. So it's
Framework agreement.
A framework agreement. And it is very creative, and it's very recent. So it is a kind of menu of commissions, and every commission is defined, but the client could use one or several in an unpredictable order of priority of this list. I hope you understand. And so, I mean, we had to think about, these two things again. So first, it's not a drawing. It cannot be a drawing. It is a succession of transformation on site. And we had to invent new commissions to be allowed to do this kind of drawings. So it is what I imported 17 years ago at this school with Pierre Bélanger. And by chance, after 17 years in France, I have now 4 big commissions like this. And it's very new, and sometimes leading big architectural firm as well. So being, as a landscape architect, a leader with Norman Foster, Christian de Porzenpark, and others. So that's very new. And I must say that very newly we won with SOM and Moisen an important competition for Detroit riverfront. And hopefully, it's not exactly the way this commission is done, but I hope we progressively could transform it in this way. So I hope this was understandable and not too boring. But it is very important, because if not, you can do all drawings you want, but it's useless. And in Bordeaux, by the way, on this right bank, they really bought the land, and it costed, let's say, 60 millions or billions of dollars. So it's not so much compared to a museum, but it's, I mean, curiously, it's a lot for landscape architecture. But now, to build it, they have 1 million per year. And it costs probably 60 other million. So it makes it 60 years long process. And I am 50, more than 50, so it's a very long way. So, of course, I hope they will find more means, but it's probably not going to happen in the coming decade. Nowhere. So it's very interesting. And another example, probably some of you know, we are involved with Ines Arantin in East Hanover, in the Novartis campus. Michael von Valkenburg did some project there years ago. And we started with, a few years ago, with a manager, there was a big master plan done with a strong urban designer, and we were supposed to do pilots, pioneers projects. And now it's shifting into a management process. I don't know if people are less sick or not, but this kind of industry seems to be a little bit less rich. So we have to do not a project, but a management process, which is a kind of extremity in this vision of processes. And because we already are building it, it is really extremely precise, because every single dollar has to be spent on the right place. And I like it. I mean, I'm very impressed by this management process rather than a project. They even don't want us to say project. We are not allowed anymore to speak about project, but only management process. That's an extremity. But it obliges us to be so precise. And every year we spend the same amount of money, like 1 or 2 or maybe more, $5 million, just to maintain in a clever way, in such a way that it builds slowly a park. Of course, we cannot have a classic master plan. And it's passion. And sorry, I stop. No, I just wanted to say you had a you had a fantastic picture about a countryside in Spain. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's exactly what we are evoking in our works. I mean, never farmer has been designing a landscape, but this is a fantastic landscape produced by very precise processes. It's exactly what we try to do.
That stay legible processes. So that leads me to my next question. Why do you choose? I mean, it's called an agricultural language, but they're basically grids of trees. These are not productive grids, right? Why that? Yes. Why geometry? Why legible geometry?
I'm trying to improve this and to lose the geometry, but it's more difficult.
No? Yes, you don't. I'm not. Please don't. But where does that come
from? So maybe it brings back to what Mossen evoked about representation. So it produces nice drawing. That's the answer. But more seriously, I mean, I'm still fighting with that. So grid and densities, that's key. So, and I've been, 1 week ago in Columbus in a very interesting colloquium where a Swedish teacher in landscape architecture, Gustafsson, explained, they have been running for 30 years an experimental forest. That's very interesting. And the same for us. I've been taught that forests were planted with a very stupid, not only a grid, but how to say that? Like in agriculture, you just open the earth with a charrue, I don't know, with this kind of very archaic tool that opens the earth on rows. You see what I mean? Very agrarian practice, very archaic agrarian practice. Okay, exactly. And along this lane, a forest guy just plants seeds or very young trees. And usually when you plant 100 forest plants, big like this, like in Parc du Saussay, only 1% becomes an adult. So you have 99% of selection, and the grid vanishes, of course. And in European forest, quite all European forests have been planted according to a grid, or at least lanes. And when you walk in a forest, first you don't notice this geometry, but when you know it, slowly you see some strange alignments of trees. So, of course, aesthetically, I love it. And nice drawing again. And also because, as you have been showing on some very real project we are doing, we need to have a presence from so nice drawing, okay, but also nice result. So we need something visible from the beginning. If you just have a random of very young trees in a field, it's very hard to see them. So I'm saying it in a cynical way, but it's important. We need a presence from the very beginning. It has to be readable, visible. And this artifice is necessary. It's not a fake nature. It is an artifice, it is a composition, and it has to be readable. So grid is sometimes helpful, not any time. There are even exaggeration with that. So it's about dealing with texture, density, management process, and about presence. Is that an answer?
Presence, yes, landscape presence. How is the work received? What is the status of those, say, for instance, in Bordeaux? Oh, that's right. Sorry. How is the work? What is the reception of the work? Are those projects in Bordeaux? Is that the one that is most advanced? It's much more advanced than Saclay and Eurolens, right? So how is that waterfront received? How is it used? How is it understood? Is it understood as a public space? Is it framed as a public realm? already, or is it a beautiful plantation of trees? How is that working?
A good question. So because when we, 20 hectares, I don't know if you can translate it, are already planted. 10 are totally finished, 10 are under construction now. And it works very well. Why? Because they built I must say, an ugly bridge, but of course, and we are building a new one. I'm teaming with Remcolas, and we are doing another bridge. So that's hopefully nice. So never sure. But the fact that there are two bridges, and Michel Courajou before did a long public space on the other bank. That's very important to be said. So the left bank has been totally transformed by Michel Courajou, but in a very more urban way, because it's already an old city.
It's historic site, yeah.
And he has $100 million, and we have one per year. So it's a different period. That's a good indication about the changes in investment in public spaces today. So it's very different. So it is a strong transformation in a city, because before, both parts of this river were inaccessible 10 years ago. So Michel Courajou transformed all this quay that is now a very successful public space. And because bridges have been built, people are already doing this kind of buckle. Is it buckle? They turn around the river. Loop. On 6 kilometers, so 12 kilometers in the very center of the city. And it is a fantastic transformation, because before, in this kind of provincial cities, on weekend, people were taking a car, driving, going to the sea, 60 kilometers west. Now people are staying in the city, and they are really enjoying this kind of spaces. So that's a very important thing. We must say that right now, from a decade in Europe, urban public spaces have been totally transformed, and urban users have been totally transformed. And it happens in Paris as well. It's strange to say, but right now, this year, they will just cancel the traffic on the right bank in the center of Paris. Some experimentation have been done years ago on the left bank. Now all banks will be public spaces rather than a kind of highway. Highway is not a good word. Motorway. So it happens today. We refurbished Marseille Harbor. We are still working on it. So it's strange, but there is a conversion of abandoned industrial, post-industrial spaces into public space. And it's not an old story. It's happening today. And to be more precise, it was supposed to happen by strong lack of means. It happens on a different way. But it happens. So about Bordeaux and this grid, I think people do not care about the way it's drawn at all. And they just can enjoy this loop. Thank you for the word. But what I noticed is this grid brings a kind of familiar rusticity. It looks like country. It doesn't look like public space. And then it gives a kind of, lightness or freedom for users. They are not stuck in a story. There is no connotation in this drawing. It doesn't evoke anything. These are rows of trees. And this is something that changed my mind. I did something in Ile-Seguin, the previous Renault factory, in the same way. Sometimes our drawings are too connotated, if this is English. They have a kind of side meaning. And this side meaning is sometimes very literal, very heavy, very useless, and boring. So in this case, we didn't care, because we know a big part of it will vanish, will be transformed, will be selected. So the drawing has not a so big importance. What has an importance is the texture, density, and at the end, it is a composition between empty spaces and dense plantation. There is a composition, a precise composition, but the texture evolves, and it has a kind of, at least, freshness. So at the end, the answer is, I don't think people have any aesthetical thinking about it, unfortunately, but at least they seem to really enjoy the freedom it brings to this space. They can use it in a very easy way.
But it brings to mind, I had never made this connection, but so for instance, in this country, let's say Olmsted always, in a way, understood that he was bringing an image that was outside of the city, some kind of notion of the American landscape, and putting it in the city. When you say that people in France often travel 60 kilometers to go to the sea or to the countryside, that countryside is very transformed already. It is highly cultivated. It's been highly cultivated for millennia. Is that their notion then of what the countryside is that is being transported, as opposed to a kind of sylvan nature that would be even further afield, say in the Alps or in America? Or, I mean, how is that connection city to country important in France as opposed to here? Because here there was a very direct, let's say, displacement of one to the other.
So it is a terrible question, because what you are saying is probably where, out of, I mean, not being totally conscious of what we are doing, probably where we have the same kind of connotation, except it's a kind of fake nature, fake country, fake agriculture that we are bringing in cities. That could happen, but I don't think so.
Right.
If not, I will kill myself. I mean, what we are bringing is a technique.
It's a technique.
It's a technique. So it's about drainage. It's about cultivation on stupid row, maintenance, and irrigation. And it is about a selection process.
But, you know, those things are luxury in this country.
Why?
Maintenance, irrigation, beautiful drainage, rows of trees. But those are the, and I'm wondering whether the sort of general consciousness in France would be those are the comforting images of landscape that we have. In this country, such an articulated structure of landscape. You see it everywhere. It's so difficult to make a straight row of trees. There isn't the craftsmanship. There isn't the possibility of even people understand that as either extremely expensive, impossible to achieve technically, or definitely non-natural. You know, because we have an obsession with curves here. Truth be said. And so, you know, how much is a kind of, you know, cultural sensibility that you're bringing, that is part of your country, that it's part of living in the land, that is very different than the way Americans think of their myths of land.
So be reassured. Clichés are globalized. And very recently, I mean, really a few days ago, so we are already building this intermediary landscape in Saclay on 7 kilometers long. It has been 6 years of fight, so we are doing it. You have been showing some picture of more than mock-up, but part of it. And of course, it is all about orchard, poplar groves, and it's very, it's a kind of micro-agriculture which works, by the way, with real agricultural schools, and these are real experimental parts. Despite this, because of our democracy process, a very local mayor have to agree on what we are building now. And the guy living in, not in country because it's very close to Paris, but it is supposed to be a country, doesn't understand it. He said it's too geometric. Why is this so geometric? I mean, and he said to me, I've been a lot in forest, and forests are not organized on rows, and he has never been looking to his forest. So being in agriculture, he has no sensibility to the world he's living in. So according to him, a forest is something curved, nature
Irregular.
is irregular. He didn't notice that his forest is absolutely artificial. Everything around himself is very organized by a geometrical practice. But he has, as a mayor, developed for the last decades, as quite all our 36,000 mayors in France, fantastic urban sprawl organized like this. So, you know, and this has been developed for several generations now, and it is in people's minds. I mean, their cultural heritage is urban sprawl. And so their reference is no longer forest, neither agriculture, neither nature, but urban sprawl. And all the landscapes that accompany it, like, you know, noise protection, I mean, kind of strange topography, supposedly done to reduce the amount of noise produced by a road close to these stupid houses. And that's a terrible loss of culture.
So we're talking about very low-grade landscape and design.
So I will meet our agricultural minister explaining to him that we have to do it now in this place because it is experimental for this agronomic school that will be welcome here. Just to try to avoid the advice of this stupid mayor. So it's about democracy, sorry. But it's stupid. I mean, they're just incompetent. And that's terrible. So since, I mean, this is something terrible. I mean, the total loss of culture about landscape architecture and landscape, I mean, they don't see it. They are living inside, they destroy it, they are still destroying it, not seeing it. They don't know what they have, and they are just losing the few things they had first.
The exported model.
Not, yeah. I
or exported from here to...
No, absolutely not.
Okay.
I mean, unfortunately not. If this was American, it could be reassuring, but it's not. I mean, our urban sprawl is it's very specific. You don't have this one. I mean,
oh, no, yes, we
you
do.
have some, but mostly not. I mean, no, you know. I mean, everybody in Europe believes it's an American model, but it's absolutely not. It has nothing because scale is ridiculous. It's a kind of camp. What we are building is a camp.
We should probably open it to the audience. Questions for Michel or for me?
I feel like I'm the warm-up act. I think it would be wonderful if you could both return to this discussion of precision, imprecision, or the way in which sometimes you have perfection, imperfection, which I think is sort of present in the idea of the agricultural regularity that then, through its erasure, becomes something that no longer appears to be regular. But there is nevertheless some sort of trace of regularity. And I think, Anita, in some of the work that you were showing, this is also very present in the process. So I'm wondering about the question of method now. How would you, because also this is in the context of the Department of Landscape Architecture and the idea of approach, what are some of the things that you would suggest as part of a mode of practice or a mode of thinking that one needs to be attentive to in a way that's different, precisely to arrive at a different way of thinking? I mean, the reason I mentioned representation, Michel, is that I actually thought beyond the rather, the importance of representation for its own sake, I thought the way in which you have actually emphasized drawing as a mode of working is a very particular medium to see landscape, to construct landscape. So we haven't really talked that much in the recent past about the status of drawing in landscape architecture. So I'm very interested in this issue of method, the status of drawing, the medium as a mechanism for thinking differently. And any thoughts you have around these kinds of topics would be very interesting to hear. Thank you.
No, in fact, this was one of my questions as well, because Michel has, when I say to him, this image, in a way, is so widely published and so beautiful and so almost copied. And Michel says, oh yes, this is the new academicism, where a semblance of process is copied or the image of process is copied, but the inquiry that leads to this, where the drawing is both analysis, description, and proposal and propositional, is lost, right? And so, so this is, I think, in terms of a method, something that we need to bring back. I think we've lost this kind of simultaneity of the drawing that is both analytical and propositional, and it's always more about a rendering or a catalog, or we've lost the sense of the drawing as something that makes you find out what the project is.
No, it's a very important theme, and I must say in my practice today, it's a key question. I mean, the risk to be stuck in a kind of simulacre, so a kind of abstract word that is very pleasant, and so you define an abstract word that is a substitution to real word, and then you act on the representation and no longer on the word represented. So you probably all remember this philosopher Baudrillard speaking about simulacre and simulation. So you invent a tool to have a simpler vision of reality that is too complex, but then you lose reality and you are just acting on a representation of reality. That, of course, happens anytime to all of us. So it is I mean, I've been studying sciences before to study landscape architecture, and I know that in sciences it's the same issue. I mean, we always have to fight against our own tools, not to be in an artifact. So you can be totally in a mistake because you are losing the degree of abstraction of your tool. So you are no longer addressing a real phenomenon, but a representation of it. So it happens anytime in our profession because we cannot act directly on 7 kilometers. So we need representations, and we have to be very careful with our representation because inevitably, is that English? It sounds very French. Okay, so I like your language. So inevitably, you are. We cannot avoid this. Sometimes your tool became a trap, and again, so what is the solution? No solution except mixing up a lot of different tools. So that's one answer. So in my office, I oblige people to do study models, renderings, perspective, and we try to do on real site mock-up, and there is no other way to mix up all these means, and as soon as the drawings start to be too nice, we kill it. I mean, before I needed it. Now I'm a little bit older and richer, I can kill some drawings. Because when the drawings start to be too nice, it's dangerous. You see, so this is what about the grid. But then more importantly, more seriously, is the control of what is shown. And by chance in landscape architecture, we are dealing with very elementary processes. You know, it's all about drainage, so very obvious, some ditches, grass, path, trees, water. It's extremely, I mean, it's why I love landscape architecture. It's because our tools are, again, inevitably elementary. We are dealing with 5 or 10 components, extremely, again, I don't know how to say that, elementary, elemental. This was the word. Not elementary, sorry. I learned. You see, with the same material, in different kind of condition, you can do very different things, and that makes it very interesting. So, if we have a very precise control about what are the mechanisms we are playing with, it's much better. Sometimes what I notice on students' work is a mixing of different kind of abstraction level. So there could be sometimes a tree and a movement of a bird. I exaggerate. Sometimes in mappings, sometimes there is a confusion in, it's not easy to explain, in the degree of abstraction of all components in the single drawing. So you could have both physical parts and social understanding. And on the same map, it produces nothing. A nice drawing, possibly, but not a tool. So it obliges, I mean, the important word is rigueur, which is French. It's all about rigueur. If we are rigorous about what we are showing, so it's precision again, but maybe an additional word will be rigueur, precise and rigorous. If we really control the kind of category that we represent, so the risk is minimized of being in a kind of sterile academism. And then, of course, killing documents and mixing tools is another way. And then, by chance, reality is the best way. So being a little bit older because I'm building things, then I don't care so much about drawings. They are real tools. And you know, when you look at, I mean, okay, it's another story, but we know like 3 drawings of André Le Nôtre. And he did a lot, you know, he did really a lot. And these drawings are perfect because the way they were designing things is exactly the way they were building them. It was by, I don't know how to say that. You take 2 stakes and a wire. A wire. So all geometry were done in real site like with a compass. And all Le Nôtre's drawings are like, exactly as it happened in real life, like a compass. So it's only about dots and radius, and everything you can do is, so it's not a wire, but I forgot the name, it's not a real wire, not a metallic wire, but a rope. A rope and 2 stakes. And everything has been done with this single tool. And Michel Courageux did a very interesting research about this, understanding Le Nôtre's work with a compass, only a compass. And that's fantastic. So, I mean, it's all about rigor and the control on tools. So, but what should be scaring sometime in all schools is this fascination for drawings that mix up different kind of categories, and mapping being seen like a process. So it's about process, not mapping. Okay, not easy. So rigueur.
Virginie? Yep.
I would like to ask you that in the case of Saclay, you won the competition against urban designers. It was not a landscape designer competition. Can you tell us how do you feel about this, being a landscape designer and finally an urban designer? There is a difference or the same things?
It's an important question. So, by the way, I won Grand Prix de l'Urbanisme, so I'm supposed to be an urban designer, but honestly, I'm not. So, I must confess this. So I think, so what I want to say is there is a confusion, there is a commercial confusion about this. I mean, and of course, urban design as landscape architecture, as architecture, corresponds to very wide range of activities. But, I mean, as landscape architects, so I'm speaking about my practice only, I have a contribution to urban design. So dimension, scale, location, exposure, slope, etc. But I'm not an urban designer in the sense of organizing buildings. It's not my competence. And of course, not designing a building. So what I really appreciate is a combination of competences. And by the way, in Saclay, I have Floris Alkemad. He used to be the urban designer of Remcolas for 20 years, and Xavier de Geter, a Belgian architect. And so we need all these competences. So understanding the structure of this natural geography and the structure of this large agronomic site is my competence, and it really helped find the location of developments. But then the development themselves has been drawn by urban designer, because it's just, another scale. And and other purpose, another volume, it's another profession, according to me, in this very precise case. And scale is not that easy. I mean, to understand, let's say, 10 miles is very, but no, I try to be more precise. Saclay is within a very large agricultural place, and 10 kilometers of agriculture is nothing. It's a very small series of fields. For a city, it's huge. People were lost. And previous urban designers have been developing this project before us, before this competition, no names. And they were totally wrong about scale. Design was okay, but they were wrong about scale. I mean, they saw it at the wrong scale, because 10 kilometers was scaring for urban designer. And for me, it was nothing. I mean, 10 kilometers of a field is not a big site. It's okay. We knew exactly how to deal with this. Then Xavier and Floris developed campuses that all are like, there are kind of unity in urban design, like 3 kilometers per 1 kilometer. More than that corresponds to a sprawl. So they defined a kind of unity of campuses, and I helped them find a location for this thing. So I'm not going to develop too much. And then public spaces is another scale, and maybe sometime another competence as well. And there is no, I did a lecture 2 years ago about this. There is no homothétie. I mean, what is solutions that corresponds to 30 miles in this case are not the solution to be developed for 10 miles, not the solution for 1 mile. And it's all different, and all different competences. So for myself, I'm not an urban designer. I'm a landscape architect, and my contribution is really helpful for urban design. Then I see these colleagues, or Inessa Anch, when we work together, it's another approach, it's another sensibility as well, it's another culture. And I have a hard time to think that a single brain can do all this. Or maybe mine is limited, but I'm not convinced by, this kind of, and sometimes it's commercial, of course. Urban designers love to say, or architect thinks they are landscape architect and vice versa, and it's not true. I mean, it's a very different approach. Of course, in my office, I mean, there are 20 architects and 20 landscape architects, but architects that dedicate their life to landscape architecture, but they have this culture of architecture, of course. So, I mean, I'm not about saying this would be stupid. There are not enclosure of competences, but personal talent or capacities. Is that an answer?
I'm just curious, having worked in Boston and grown up in Chicago with the Burnham Plan, it was a comment you made early on, and I'd be interested about what Anita thinks coming. I know she came from Caracas and is not from the Boston area initially, and you taught here and we're here, about the you put the context of Olmsted and the Boston park system in a new way that I hadn't thought about, because I worked for the park system and worked on a part of Charles Eliot's system for 20 years of building out along the Neponset River, which the drawing and the preciseness of that as a 100-year-old plan was extremely important to me as a project manager of making decisions in the present day on what, and but yet the land at the same time was determining what was appropriate and what was not. But I always thought in my training, they were trained about England and all the historical landscape architects and the European tradition. I just was very surprised that you were talking about the Boston and American park system in the way you talked about it. And I don't know if there's anything more to say or to expand upon that, but I just found that as a curious statement from my point of view of having always known Boston, always been in Boston, and then looked to Europe for other models.
Maybe there is an answer that comes not from Olmsted the father, but the son. And it's about Georgetown, you know the project. So when they built this university site close to Washington, Olmsted's son was involved, and he has a commission from 90 to 1950. So that's fantastic for you Americans. I mean, a 50 years commission. The firm was involved during 50 years. And interestingly, there are a lot of documentation, because at this time in 90, they had pictures, and we still have a lot of documentation. I mean, everybody can have an access to it. It's easy to find. There are a lot of booklets showing drawings, picture. And by the way, you have been showing one of these drawings, this parkway, and they had layered parkways. And ironically, in this Olmsted Sons documentation, there were a lot of drawings from Paris and Saclay. So when we started Saclay, I forgot to say that, we were absolutely lost. We did not know how to take such a big site. And we were looking for some references. And we found this Georgetown study. And not only study, but what has been done, which is fantastic. And we saw Saclay woods, listed woods, as a reference for the Georgetown park system. So, and there were a lot, because Le Forestier, we had a landscape architect in France that was very close to Olmsted's work, and I know there has been some exchanges between the father and Le Forestier. And Olmsted's son was using European references to show that in close to Paris, west of Paris, there were a lot of large forest continuities that were a kind of framework for urban development. And so I don't know if this is an answer, but no, probably not. But
I was going to say that for me, the way to enter that is in its urban histories, because all of the parks and landscapes had another form before, another use. So royal hunting grounds were the first public parks. And that's why they're not interconnected in the way that the Americans are, because there were no royal hunting grounds in a country with only democracy. And so it became a networked forest preserve, interconnected river model. And in Caracas, there were coffee and sugarcane plantations, privately owned, that would, with a geometry, with a logic to that territory, that then were transformed into a different kind of public park. And so I think that landscape that preceded the city, on which the city entered, on which different forms of land tenure happened, give a sensibility to, and its own history to the system of public landscapes. And that's why it's interesting, for instance, in the case of Olmsted, how he's transposing certain sensibilities in, and in France, in the same way, how certain sensibilities continue to be brought in or worked with that do not get worked on in here. But that's also where the process thing enters, because when they begin to find new types of work, because we're at a different stage in the urban history, then that requires a new process on how to enter and approach the work, which is what Eliot and Olmsted were doing.
But
and they're doing now.
Sorry, there is something I should add, and I forgot to speak about this, about the question urban design, landscape architect. What is extremely interesting in this park system in the US is the fact that infrastructures are associated to park system. And especially this is the case in Georgetown, where park systems were done for viability. I mean, this was about water management on previous creek, plus location of main roads related to geography. So my understanding of it is an understanding of existing geography enhanced, and with this geography, it's a landscape built by enhancement that give coherence to both water management, of course park, but mostly traffic engineering. And that was a key invention. So this was the missing part of my answer. Of course, roads are very important, accesses, practice, and meaning not only the technical road, but the perception you have of a site. Because when you are in Washington, so when you land, first you have an access to the city from a park system. And then when you go to Georgetown again, and you are never lost. I mean, what is fantastic in the US for me is because you have this park system enhancing natural geography, and then Jefferson Grid, and that's it. And you don't need a GPS in the US. In Europe, if you don't have a GPS, you are dead. Because engineers have their own logic that has no connection with urban design, neither with landscape, of course. And so you just don't understand where you are driving to in Europe. Without GPS, don't try. And in the US, you don't need a GPS. I've been trying this, or maybe I'm too optimistic, but I don't think so.
I think, yes, you're talking about the best examples in this country.
No. I mean, I've been driving a lot in the US. Like I've never lost.
So can I...
Till now.
Okay.
Can I just use that productive comment to thank you both, Anita and Michel. I think that you've both really started something. I really feel that there's a lot of things that have been said, but I think there's a lot of things that haven't been said, which is sometimes quite a good thing. But I feel that there are a lot of people in this room who have a lot to contribute to this discussion, and they have been silent. And it would be wonderful to have the opportunity to use this. And I think you have given us the prompt to really begin a much more specific, focused conversation about the status of thinking about landscape architecture. I do want to, because I think there are also a lot of students here, I do think that it's worth saying that this is a very important moment to really think through how one makes landscape architecture. And it's been there in the background, but I'm not so sure. I mean, I really like the way that Michel is talking about the relationship to the ground and the scale of one-to-one and making things. At the same time, I think it's very important to recognize the history of the traditions of landscape architecture being so deeply embedded in questions of visuality, and the fact that, you know, in a sense, so much of the ideas of landscape are also related to painting and to the issue of what it looks like, and the space between what the thing looks like and how the thing is made, in a way. And I think just trying to bridge that gap between sort of, and addressing questions of sort of visuality, sensation, and in this sense, the kind of the pragmatism of the doing. I think there's an enormous amount. How do you actually negotiate between those kinds of moments in the tradition of landscape? And this is something that I feel it actually isn't really written about. It's not discussed systematically, and yet the history and theories of landscape architecture has such a rich tradition that I think you have given us a great deal to begin this discussion, and I hope that we will have the chance to have some of these conversations together, and certainly in the context of the studios and the way in which, you know, the future of some of the studios will actually deal with the continuing of this kind of discussion. So thank you both very much, and thank you all.